Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and I'm very glad you're joining us again today. Today I am freshly back from Gary Null's Paradise Gardens down in Naples, Florida, where we had a spectacular last 2 weeks with very special groups of people who were very committed to their own health and happiness and well-being, and to the detoxification process on all levels. Physical, of course, emotional, clearly, and spiritual. And as a result, we had a lot of goodwill and cheer among the groups and a lot of success. So in future, if you are interested in these kinds of results that we have seen among all people, really, who participated, make sure to stay in touch with Gary Null and arrange for yourself to be there next time. Well, today, in light of the upcoming Independence Day, July 4th, which is funnily falling on a Wednesday this year, I have invited presidential candidate in the Justice Party, Rocky Anderson, who you have heard on these airwaves before, back in December when I first brought Rocky to PRN, and then in actually the first show of the new year on A Better World. And you have also heard Gary Null interview him, along with Ralph Nader and Gary Johnson are his running mate, as Gary has been emphasizing third-party independent candidates. Well, as have I been. And it was in that light that when I began reflecting on this particular Independence Day, where I think so many Americans feel less independent than ever and being made to be more dependent than ever, it was really worth our while here at A Better World to take a good look at this whole subject of independence, and you could say, what happened to it? What happened to the original principles of our country, our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, which have been so seriously eroded and corroded over the past several administrations? You could make a case that it's been getting eroded for really the better part of a century, and I think that wouldn't be altogether incorrect, even with the advent of the Federal Reserve Act back in 1913. You could say that was a certain offense to the idea of the maintenance of the United States Treasury as being the federal agency to take care of money, fiduciary responsibility, and the currency of the U.S. dollar. But not even reaching back that far to stay a little bit more current and contemporary, just going back several administrations, I think that we will see some offenses. And there's really hardly a better person to explore this with than presidential candidate Rocky Anderson. Let me get these glasses more on my head this time. Okay, so as an introduction, I would like you all to know that Rocky is running for president. He is, and a little biography here, which is very much in keeping. He is the former two-term mayor of Salt Lake City between years 2000 and 2008. And when he was a lawyer prior to being elected, he also declined running a third term, which was being requested of him. He decided to open up and follow his heart, which was to open up a nonprofit organization to help people with the issues surrounding human rights, which he had done as an award-winning lawyer for some 21 years prior to his election as mayor of Salt Lake City. During his legal career, Rocky, listed in Best Lawyers in America, handled many complex commercial cases, including antitrust and security matters for plaintiffs who had suffered harm. In the 1980s, Rocky was instrumental in obtaining payments for thousands of depositors who had lost their life savings in Utah's failed thrifts, lost because of the rollbacks of regulations by then the Reagan administration, who did not believe in government, actually. Curious, he was the head of it, and certainly he didn't believe in regulations. At the end of his term, however, he had to reinstate regulations, much to the dismay and chagrin of many of his Republican associates, because the results were so disastrous. Savings and loans presidents were breaking the law left and right, and Charles Keating et al. Found themselves in jail. Something that we would like to see happen to current bank owners and presidents, but because of the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act and because Obama has no will to prosecute criminally any of his buddies down on Wall Street, that isn't happening. A few more words on Rocky Anderson. Rocky has always been committed to the principle that justice, social justice, environmental justice, and economic justice must be an essential aim of public policy. His heartfelt commitment to social justice is reflected in many of the numerous articles and columns he has authored for many publications. A few more words is to say that when George W. Bush began the illegal and warranted Iraq War, Rocky was one of the few who stood on the national stage publicly to declare that G.W. Bush should be impeached for war crimes and a slew of other unconstitutional acts, and that we should never have gone into the war back when it was very popular to go to the war. The drums were definitely beating in that direction, and there were very few salmon willing to swim upstream. Rocky was one of them. So that he is running for president now is something that we all should be taking note of. Certainly you should check out his website at www.voterocky.org, and we have video of him on the homepage of our website, www.abetterworld.tv. So, Rocky, are you on the line?
I am here. Thank you, Mitchell. It's great to be with you.
Absolutely. A pleasure to have you back again, Rocky. And I wanted to invite you on today because in light, as I said before, and in honor of the July 4th Independence Day celebrations that are going to be occurring straight across our country, there's a fair amount of sadness among progressives and cultural creatives and thinking, caring people, because they are bearing witness, we are bearing witness to a country that is losing its foothold in its original principles as espoused by its original documents, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and you could say its initial spirit of the Founding Fathers. And I thought you were just an eminently qualified person running for president as you are because of the degradation that you've witnessed to be on today's show with me to discuss this matter.
We really have been betrayed as a people. The promise of this nation, the promise of the founders and of the Constitution, of the kind of nation that we all grew up in, that even though it had its failings, we all aspired for so much better based on those promises. And Mitchell, it seems at times these last 12 years, we've just sort of given up on that. And by we, I'm not saying there aren't some exceptions to this.
Sure.
But certainly both of the major parties.
Well, the two major parties, exactly, Rocky, have become virtually merged into one, which is something that we've never thought would happen. And there has been also a marginalization of all other independent parties, of which you are now one. And what do you have to say about that in terms of the original purport of this country's democratic, free-minded political perspective?
Well, George Washington was scared to death that we would ever have parties in this country.
At all?
And the founders were as well, at all. Because they saw the threat, and we're seeing it in so vividly now that the parties look out for the parties, that it becomes the partisanship that's important rather than the principle, rather than the public interest.
Yes.
And so Republicans and Democrats alike look at what they're willing to do to this country in order to get a political leg up. I mean, the Republicans last time, with regard to the debt ceiling issue, they were holding this nation hostage. They were willing to let this nation default, where the full faith and credit of the United States government wouldn't be worth anything near what it's been worth since our nation's founding.
Since inception,
and
exactly.
The consequence of what they did do, because they took it so far and because of the threat of a default in the future because of this kind of shameful conduct, is that we're paying more money on what we borrow because we have a lowered credit rating.
Yes.
Imagine that.
It's hard to believe
in our lives, for the first time in our nation's existence.
All of U.S. history, there has been a lowered risk rating, exactly. Well, a higher risk rating, I mean, but a lowered rating by Moody's, exactly. No, it's terrifying. What I didn't know that George Washington abhorred parties. And so what was it that he and the other founding fathers, Rocky, had in mind then for when people would run for public office?
That it would be a meritocracy, that we'd be electing people on the basis of their merit, of what they truly had to offer to the American people, rather than them succeeding in these parties that end up only fighting for their own existence and for their own advantage. And
right, at the expense of everybody and everything else, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the logical conclusion of that is, because of the role of money in government, is that now they sell off to those with the money in complete abrogation of their obligations to the American people and even of our Constitution.
So what would you say to people who see what you're saying, have come to understand that the Republican and Democratic parties are but what Ralph Nader called twiddly-dum and twiddly-dee, the i.e., so little distinction between them at this point in time? They're reaching into the same corporate pockets for their campaign funding. What would you say to the American people about what their options are relative to this debacle, you could say, of our political process?
Well, I'm never one to say that there's not a nickel's worth of difference between the two, because there is. We see the Democratic Party a little bit ahead of the Democratic Party ahead of the Republicans in terms of sustaining Social Security. Although now we have a Democratic president who's already put on the table what could be significant cuts in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, but at least fighting off the privatization of those programs.
Yes.
So there are some differences. I think in terms of who's going to be nominated to the Supreme Court, there are some differences, but the similarities are so much greater, and the fundamental similarity is they all play the game by the same set of rules, and that is they're bought and paid for. I often say they're all feeding at the same trough of special interest money, and they're not out to change this perverse, corrupt system that we have. We don't hear Mitt Romney or Barack Obama saying we've got to cut off the flow of money from Wall Street, because look at what came about as a result of deregulation and
Citizens United,
repeal of Glass-Steagall and all the rest of it, which we never would have had it not been for the corrupting influence of money.
Well, we have to remember that it was during
about real change.
We have to still remember, Rocky, that Glass-Steagall was canceled, repealed during 1999 in the Clinton administration.
At the behest of his Treasury Secretary, who Obama brought in as his chief economic advisor. That's how twisted this all
Larry
is.
Summers.
And then they surround themselves, Larry Summers, and then they surround themselves with all these alumni from Goldman Sachs and the rest of these Wall Street folks who go through this revolving door from the financial industry to government and back to the financial industry, and they're all stuffing their pockets with millions of dollars because of what they're able to do when they're in government, and it's completely shafted the American people. So you asked me what I would say to the American people?
Yes.
Number one, there are solutions. This isn't natural. It's not just the marketplace and the invisible hand having its way with all of us. It's been because of bad public policy. And in our nation's history, we've seen these kinds of things turn around. We saw it during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration, when he was willing to stand up against the banks, when he was willing to put in place after or during the Depression things like Glass-Steagall, said there's not going to be common ownership of commercial banks, investment banks, and insurance companies. We're not going to allow this concentration of power. We're not going to let them put the banks at risk anymore so that there's this damage done to the country. So what do we have now? Have you heard Barack Obama or Mitt Romney say, we've got to break up once and for all the banks that are too large to fail?
No.
If you've heard it, I missed the news.
No. It wasn't said. In fact, the film Inside Job, as you probably know, Rocky, won the Academy Award 2 years ago for Best Documentary, and in it outlined like verse and chapter of how the debacle of the 2008 banking crash occurred, who was in on it, who prior to that was making the decisions, how the SEC got knocked out of the box. So did what is that other agency? I forget the name of it. Go ahead. The Commodities and Exchange Commission. Something like that.
Yeah.
They got knocked out of the box by
Futures Improvement Act of 2000, which did away with any reserve requirements, so that you can
that's another issue, right?
Sell financial insurance and not have anything there to back it up, and then when you're called upon to back up your promises, you come to the United States government
and they bail you out
billions of dollars.
Exactly. But the point is that Alan Greenspan almost single-handedly, along with, I should say, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and his other cronies there, kept federal agencies from doing their own righteous due diligence and legislate about derivatives and about credit default swaps. They basically forbade that. I would like you to take a look, if you would, for us and our audience here, at the Constitution and some of the more recent, over the past 12 years, as you cited, because I think that's a very critical time period when the Constitution has been assaulted and virtually decimated. What particular pieces of legislation have been passed that you deem unconstitutional? And I imagine that if you were, God willing, to be made president, elected president, you would repeal.
Well, and it's not just legislation, it's acts by the executive branch.
Executive orders?
This ratcheting up of the imperial presidency, and it's also the way in which the courts have passed on their role as a check on abuses of power by the other branches. Let's just go down. I mean, fundamental to our republic and our Constitution is a system of checks and balances where we have three co-equal branches of government that provide checks on each other so that there aren't abuses of power, so that we have this separation of power to protect our nation and its people from abuses.
Yes.
And so what have we seen in the last 12 years? We see victims of illegal torture. We see those who have challenged illegal surveillance every instance of which was a felony under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, go to our courts and say, okay, this is the American way. People in the executive branch violated the laws. We're here to have the courts hold them accountable. And under this subversive state secrets doctrine, which is a court-made rule, it's not from legislation, it's nowhere found in our Constitution. The executive branch, the very perpetrator, goes to the courts and tells the courts that we, the executive branch, determined that there would be the disclosure of important state secrets if these cases were allowed to go forward. Therefore, the courts have to dismiss the cases, and the courts have done it. That spells absolute tyranny. When the law no longer applies, when the executive branch says that they are above the law, that they can't be held accountable to the law in the courts, and the courts dutifully step aside, that is an unbelievable betrayal.
You're absolutely right.
Is at the core of our constitutional system of government. And then related to that, of course, are the massive violations of the War Power Clause. Who has the sole prerogative to decide whether this country's going to go to war? It's Congress. It's not the President. The President is the commander-in-chief that's to oversee our armed forces after Congress has made the decision that we go to war. But there hasn't been a declaration of war by Congress since World War II. Our involvement in Korea, President Truman sending of troops there without Congress making the determination, was blatantly unconstitutional. So was our involvement in Vietnam. Even though Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, that was an unconstitutional delegation of Congress's sole prerogative to let the President decide in his sole discretion whether we would go to war. And of course, he lied to this country. Gulf of Tonkin was built on lies.
It was a false flag operation.
Just as the authorization to use force against Iraq after 9/11 and other nations.
And Afghanistan as well is another illegal war.
That's right. So the decision now by President Obama to engage in acts of war, the dropping of bombs over Libya, the killing of people, including hundreds of innocent civilians in Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia, in Afghanistan, and we still have unmanned drones flying over Iraq, which has infuriated the Iraqi people. All of those are acts of war, and in none of these instances has there been a declaration by Congress authorizing these acts of war. Now, Fourth Amendment, the Constitution, the prohibition against unreasonable searches and seizures without a warrant. President Bush told this nation that in every instance when we engaged in surveillance of suspected terrorists, they were getting warrants. It was a bald-faced lie. It came out about 2 or 2.5 years after he'd given the order to the National Security Agency. There had been, at that point, thousands of felonies committed against American citizens. They were subjecting our emails to surveillance, our telephone conversations to surveillance, and when there was a challenge, the court threw the cases out for lack of standing, saying that the plaintiffs couldn't determine whether their communications were subjected to surveillance, and the reason they couldn't get that determination was because of the state secrets doctrine. The administration argued that it would mean the disclosure of important state secrets to give them that information. You know what it would have entailed? Not important state secrets. It would have entailed the disclosure that the executive branch had been engaging in major felonies, and they didn't want that out. That, again, that is the very definition of tyranny. Now, in terms of due process, under the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, under President Obama, he's been targeting a number of people, including U.S. citizens, for assassination. No semblance of due process. It's on his say and on the say of people who many times have been wrong about their information. Wrong is when they kidnapped and tortured Maher Arar, a citizen from Canada who had no connection whatsoever to terrorism. When they kidnapped and sent away for over 3 months and tortured Khalid al-Masri, a German citizen, and it was all on the basis of mistaken identity. That was the CIA in both those instances. They can make huge mistakes, and yet without any due process now, our president and others in his administration get together, they look at these baseball card-like biographies and make a determination as to whether these people will live and die, knowing that if there are going to be drone attacks against them, there are going to be in the process hundreds of innocent civilians die at the same time. A blatant violation of due process. And then also, of course, the NDAA, the provision that government can round up anybody at any time, anywhere in the world, including U.S. citizens, and hold them indefinitely, meaning up to the rest of their lives, without criminal charges being posted against them, without a trial, without the assistance of legal counsel, and without the right of habeas corpus. It is the most un-American, subversive thing that this nation, or that any president or any Congress has ever done. Completely in violation of due process.
A little light on that, Rocky, which you may know, that Chris Hedges and Noam Chomsky et al., Cornel West, did sue Obama on this, and it was heard, and the judge ruled that those sections of the law that you just cited that would allow the indefinite detention without due process were overruled by her. And yes, it will need to get bumped up to another higher court, most likely, because it will be appealed. But as of this moment, it was adjudged to be unconstitutional.
Yeah, well, don't find too much comfort in that, because the same thing happened in the surveillance case. The district court ruled that the warrantless wiretapping and other surveillance of American citizens was a violation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and of the Fourth Amendment, but it went up to the Court of Appeals. In a 2-1 decision, the Court of Appeals, they said these people had no standing to complain because they weren't able to show that it happened to them. And again, they weren't able to show that it happened to them because of the state secrets doctrine that disallowed them from getting that information from government. So we've got a long ways to go here.
You sure do.
Now, what about Article 6 of the Constitution? If you take a look at it, the supreme law of the land is comprised of 3 things: the Constitution, laws passed by Congress, and treaties. And yet this is a country now that is an absolute international outlaw, that disregards treaties at random. I mean, the Geneva Conventions, George Bush said, no, the Geneva Conventions aren't going to apply here. Well, the Supreme Court later said absolutely they do apply, that there is no crack in the Geneva Conventions that allows some people to fall through so that you can torture them. And by the way, the decision to torture during the Bush administration was the first time in our nation's history ever that torture was allowed as a matter of official policy. There's another treaty, the Convention Against Torture, which has a very clear mandatory provision that all signatory nations, including the United States, must prosecute those responsible for torture. And in fact, President Reagan, when the Senate ratified the Convention Against Torture during his administration, he made it very clear that finally those signatories to this convention are all saying that we will in every instance prosecute those who are responsible for torture. That was President Reagan.
Why was there not an international court that sought to enforce this kind of legislation?
Well, I actually got a...
against Bush and Cheney.
I got a petition signed by thousands of people. We submitted it not only to Attorney General Holder and President Obama, but to the United Nations, the United Nations Committee Against Torture, calling upon them to do exactly that.
Mm-hmm.
But if this is the supreme law of the land, and it's been completely disregarded by President Obama, who said, about those instances of torture, let's just move forward and not look back.
Not look back, exactly.
When it comes to torture, and it's not only a matter of violating the treaties that apply to torture, but also our own domestic law. The War Crimes Act of 1996 clearly makes it illegal to torture, as does our anti-torture statute under federal law. But let's look at the other treaty obligations that have been completely disregarded. The Kellogg-Briand Pact absolutely made illegal the commission of aggressive war. An aggressive war, very simply, is attacking a nation that has not already attacked you or is not imminently about to attack you. And Iraq wasn't attacking the United States, wasn't about to attack the United States, had nothing to do with 9/11, posed no danger. In fact, Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell both had said just prior to 9/11 that they didn't pose a danger even to their neighbors because they'd been disarmed after the first Gulf War. Kellogg-Briand was utilized as a justification at the Nuremberg tribunals to prosecute and convict those responsible for aggressive war. And the chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, Chief Justice Roberts of the United States Supreme Court, said in his opening statement that for this international prohibition against aggressive war to have real meaning, it must be utilized and held against not only aggressor Germany at Nuremberg, but against every nation on earth, including those sitting in judgment at Nuremberg. And now we just absolutely ignore it. But since the Kellogg-Briand Pact, since Nuremberg, we have signed on to the United Nations Charter, which makes it absolutely illegal under international law to do what we did in Iraq. And 2 Secretaries General of the United Nations stated unequivocally that what the United States did was illegal under international law. And Jimmy Carter, by the way, not even 2 weeks ago, published an op-ed piece in the New York Times about the massive human rights violations under the Obama administration, under our federal government. And he said, pointed out that 10 of the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights have been violated by this administration. And then you talk about what other violations of the Constitution.
Let's first let everybody know, we have to just announce that you are listening to Mitchell J. Rabin on A Better World on the Progressive Radio Network airwaves. We are spending this hour dedicated to understanding the lack of independence that we currently have in our country relative to the original notions and insight, essence, spirit of our founding fathers in light of our upcoming Independence Day celebrations, where fireworks and firecrackers will be going off across the nation while people blindly believe that we still have the nation that we had back when it was originally founded. Rocky Anderson, running for president on the Justice Party, is making very clear what we have done in our country, what our past several administrations have done to abrogate the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, leading us down a path that is actually completely anti-American and anti-humane based on the original purports and tenets of the Constitution. So, Rocky, please do continue.
And Mitchell, I'd like to add to what you just said. As people are out there celebrating the 4th of July, and they're watching the fireworks, and they're feeling all patriotic about things, they've got to understand patriotism isn't about mindlessness.
Correct.
It's not about lack of awareness. It's not about simply going along to get along. I said in a speech one time when we were protesting the involvement in Iraq and what was going on under the Bush administration, including all the human rights violations and violations of the Constitution, I said, blind faith in poor leadership is not patriotism. And I hope everybody will keep that in mind. It's not just following whoever's there. It's rather sticking by your principles, sticking by what this nation really stands for. Teddy Roosevelt, a great Republican president, made the point that for people to just be servile and line up behind a president, regardless of what he or she does, is not patriotism. It's being servile. It's actually being unpatriotic. When you forget about what this nation really stands for and you fail to stand up and do what's required.
That is such a good point.
Those constitutional values and practices.
That's right. In fact, you could really say, Rocky, that it is the American citizens' obligation to enact and apply the First Amendment, to engage in free speech and critique what it is that is not right, not to mention what's illegal and unethical, but to stand up and speak his or her truth in the face and for the benefit of the government. That's the purpose of whistleblowing. That's the purpose of speaking out for the common good.
Absolutely. And in connection to that,
yes, please go on.
Remember, politics in this country shouldn't just be a team sport. You shouldn't just put the big D or the big R on your jersey and go out and fight for your team no matter what they do.
Yes.
We're all Americans. And if we all value what the Constitution provides, if we all value the long-term institutions and the ethic of this country, and much of that is based on fundamental morality, if we agree with all of that, we have to stand up against those in our own parties.
Yes.
When we see them engaging in the wholesale violations of those values, of those constitutional rights and liberties and responsibilities that we've been talking about during this program.
Exactly.
Let me add one other thing. We've talked about the undermining of checks and balances and separation of power. We've talked about the complete disregard for the war power clause, the undermining of the Fourth Amendment, the requirement that there not be unreasonable searches and seizures and that there be a warrant in each instance. The undermining of due process, both with the targeting U.S. citizens for assassination and indefinite detention, even of U.S. citizens with no semblance of due process. We've talked about basically just disregarding treaties as if they're something that are voluntary from day to day, rather than considering under Article 6 that they are among the supreme law of the land.
Yes.
But also look at the guarantee of equal protection of the laws under the Constitution. We have that now for certain categories of people, but for members of the GLBT community, even our president, who finally, after he said for years that his thinking on the issue was evolving, which I found to be just political
gibberish, right?
It's just unbelievable that somebody would make that excuse for not taking a position. Well, finally, he was forced into a position. And he said, well, yeah, I think the people of the same sex should be able to get married. And all the millions of dollars started flowing in, and there, rainbow stickers for Obama on Facebook and all the rest of it. Unbelievable. When the same person is saying, but we'll leave it up to the states. So he's president of the United States. Is he going to say that federal protections for equal protection of the law for people of different races, ethnic origin, different religions, that should just be a matter for the states?
That should be state defined, right?
No, we all understand that is something that we have in common, all of us, and that it's only right that there be federal protections. But this president, when it comes to members of the GLBT community, he utters a few of the right words, he cashes in on it, but he will not stand up for federal protection for marriage equality. And I think that is absolutely shameful.
It's just a political animalness that our current system has been breeding now for decades. It's unwarranted, it's corrupt, it's immoral, and it continues in the face of reality, if you will. You know, it's like a very bad reality TV show, Rocky. You know?
And it's just, you can read the script. You can predict the script of these people. It's no wonder that people are so cynical about our government. But I would caution those who just get so excited and they say, oh, the president just made an utterance. Let's all line up behind him. Take a look at what he's willing to do or what he won't do.
Well, and
he will not take action to provide for equality for members of the GLBT community. End of story. Understand it, face up to it, because 4 years ago, there were so many people that were drinking the Kool-Aid and thinking that he really meant what he said on so many issues.
Yes.
Whether it was ending the wars, whether it was ending the Bush tax cuts, whether it was closing Guantanamo, whether it was providing international leadership on climate change. He's done none of those things. And now he makes this utterance about marriage equality, but then at the same time, he's leaving it up to the states and provides, once again, no federal leadership. And finally, and this is so dangerous when it comes to our system of government and the people's trust in our government. We believe, all Americans, and when those fireworks are blowing off, think of the phrase, justice, that we're a nation of justice for all, or is it justice for some? And we've created now, and the American people have basically stood by complacently while this has happened, a two-tiered system of justice, where there's the very elite, the rich and the powerful, that when they commit the offenses, they commit war crimes, they commit warrantless wiretapping, they commit massive financial fraud on Wall Street, they're given a waiver by the President of the United States. Let's look forward, not backwards. He brought in more money from Wall Street in campaign contributions during his last race than anybody in history. And then after the financial meltdown, there's so many people in this country crippled economically. 1/3 of pension plans, they lost 1/3 of their value across the country on average. And all of the financial fraud that we saw, people calling these derivative instruments AAA rated investments, and they were being sold to the pension plans and to others. Goldman Sachs selling their customers on billions of dollars of these instruments, and at the same time on their own account betting against them.
Exactly.
And raking in the money afterwards.
And none of this is criminalized. None of it is criminalized.
Well, it is. It actually is. It's all financial fraud.
Oh, it's all financial fraud, but it's not being criminalized, criminally prosecuted. That's the problem.
Exactly right.
They're
and
just,
my point.
as you said, a free ticket. Exactly. I mean, as recently as today, Rocky, GlaxoSmithKline was found guilty of a $3 billion fraud case, defrauding the American people and the medical pharmaceutical industry. They will pay a fine. No one will go to jail. There will be no found wrongdoing. There will only be a settlement in President Obama's Justice Department.
And yet if you went and shoplifted a loaf of bread to feed your family because you're out of work, your home's been foreclosed upon, there are no jobs programs to speak of, you're going to be held to account under the law in the most aggressive ways. And you know what? no, you're not going to be able to offer the defense to that judge and jury, oh, let's just look forward and not backwards.
Exactly.
That defense is reserved only for the richest and the most powerful in this country.
I'd like to ask you,
we have a two-tiered
system by all means. I'd like to ask you, because it's such an opportunity to speak with you who are so educated as to the workings and mechanisms of government, and I'm very pleased and honored to be doing so and sharing your knowledge and wisdom and heart with our audience here at PRN and A Better World. What is this mechanism? I'd really like to understand when a president appoints an attorney general, U.S. attorney general. How in the world could the attorney general actually stand in light of checks and balances of the three branches of government, Rocky, stand alone and independently from the executive branch? Is he not, pardon the expression, beholden then, as we have seen with Eric Holder, I should call him Eric Beholden, to the president? And in every single case of which I am aware, the same phenomenon occurs. There was a little scrappiness once with Janet Reno and Bill Clinton, but that was quickly put to rest. How in the world could there be a proper checks and balances maintained with that appointment? And the other question I'd like to ask you about is, what is the legal and constitutional basis of executive orders? Please speak.
Okay. As to the attorney generals and their independence, there have been attorneys general who have stood up to their presidents. Elliot Richardson's probably the most famous example of that, when he stood up against Nixon. But actually, in connection with Holder, when he was trying to determine whether he would move to hold those responsible for torture accountable under the law,
yes,
I believe it was Newsweek did a chart showing those attorneys general who did whatever the president wanted them to do and was basically their puppet. And a lot of them have gone down in infamy. I mean,
Gonzalez, others.
And then there are those who stood up courageously, and they applied the rule of law.
Isn't it just inherently compromised, though? That's my. It's sort of inherently compromised because there is an inclination to do the bidding of the executive branch by the very appointment itself, as with the Supreme Court, for that matter. That's a little different. I'm sorry?
I think it's way different because they've got life appointments, and we've seen members of the Supreme Court conduct themselves exactly the opposite of what was expected. Earl Warren, Justice Souter, they both turned out completely different than the presidents who nominated them thought they were going to do.
Well, just go back to the Attorney General.
The same has been true with attorneys general over time. We've either had the courageous, principled attorneys general, or we've had the puppets. And I know that, I mean, at least it seemed for a period of time that Eric Holder was really trying to assert his ground as the Attorney General and applying the rule of law, and really was tortured over this whole, excuse the pun, over the whole issue of holding people accountable for violations of law for their role in torture.
Well, until he became a lapdog.
Until he became a puppet. He absolutely showed his true colors. Yes. He has been the president's lapdog. I think he, like our president, when it comes down to it, let what they view as pragmatism, and that means political advantage in most instances when it comes to them, overrule a principled application of the law. And they forget about what really their calling is, what they ought to be doing. And if it means that Eric Holder is going to be fired by the president, then so be it.
Exactly.
What a proud thing to be able to stand
on principle. Exactly. You know, we have to also admit that it very much appears that President Obama is a lapdog to other major interests down on Wall Street. If you could, because we're beginning to run out of time here, we have only a couple of more minutes, could you respond to the question of the constitutionality of executive orders?
Yeah, executive orders have their place, but they can't override the Constitution, and they can't override Congress's role in establishing what the law is. So, there were executive orders years ago making it clear there were to be no assassinations. There have been executive orders that have dealt with things like the environment and setting the tone for administrative agencies within the executive branch.
Okay. When did they begin? Historically, are you aware?
Pardon me?
Are you aware of when they began historically? In whose administration?
Oh, I don't know when the first executive order was. I'm sure they go back almost to the beginning.
Oh, yeah. Okay. But, I was just wondering from the constitutional point of view, since that has been an underlying theme of today's show, was to look at how we stand now relative to the Constitution, and you have made a very powerful case, Rocky, of how we have veered so far to the side, to the margins, that we can hardly recognize the fundamental tenets of the Constitution in today's current law.
Well, and that's right. What we saw with the signing statements under President Bush, and some of that's been continued during the Obama administration, there's the same danger there.
Exactly.
Congress passes laws, and they're the ones that state what the law is to be. The president either signs the bills into law, or he or she vetoes them and sends them back for Congress. They either override the veto or their history.
That's right.
But instead of going through that repeal process or the veto process, presidents like Obama and Bush write out signing statements, issue them at the time of signing these bills into law, giving their interpretations, even going so far, and Obama did this in his first months in office, said that basically instructed his administration not to follow the law because in his view it was unconstitutional.
There we go.
That's an absolute outrage under our constitutional system.
Rocky Anderson, I want to thank you again, truly, for your service to our country and for standing up to run for the presidency of the United States through the Justice Party, and for all of what you contribute here to a better world and PRN as well. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. And I urge your listeners, go to voterocky.org. You'll see a lot of good substantive information there. And this really is about solutions. It's not just complaining about the way things are. It's about all of us assuming the responsibility and taking the opportunity to turn all of this around.
Exactly. Rocky Anderson, thanks so much for joining us here today. And I will speak with you another time, and we'll have you back.
Thank you very much, Mitchell.
Absolutely. This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World. Thanks so much for joining us. If you are not yet part of our newsletter, go to www.abetterworld.tv and sign on. It's free. It announces the shows every week on Mondays on PRN, on Wednesdays Blog Talk Radio, and on A Better World MNN on television every Tuesday night. It's a pleasure to be of service to you all. I so appreciate your participation here. As you see, we are seeking step by step to change the world. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.